what I'm going to read here is from a book that comes out in 2 months. It's called A Safeway in Arizona. And the Safeway there refers, of course, to the grocery chain, which was the mundane place, store 1211 at the corner of Ina Road and Oracle Road, about 2 miles from where I grew up in my hometown of Tucson, Arizona. And this is where 10 months ago to the day, on January 8th of this year, U.S. Representative Gabrielle Giffords was holding a meet and greet event to reach out to her constituents. It's called Congress on Your Corner. And she did many of these events every year. She tried to do them as often as possible, believing that one-on-one contact with her constituents was the best and most fundamental way to understand what her constituents were thinking. And Gabrielle had been a friend of mine, is a friend of mine for 10 years. And I had gotten to know her when I was still a newspaper reporter. And as a result of our friendship, I could not write anything about her. I couldn't cover her. I was too biased. I simply liked her too much. And that was all well and good, because as a reporter, you don't be friends with the people you cover. Nor do you take political stances, give money to candidates, God forbid, do any volunteer work for a candidate. That is simply forbidden. But after I left the practice of newspapering, it was when my friend Gabrielle called me one day and said that the man who had represented Tucson in Congress for the past 20 years, Jim Colby, was going to retire. And this was a once-in-a-generation event, really. And she felt that she could make a contribution, that it was her time to run, and asked me, would I come help her? Would I move back to Arizona to do whatever it took, write speeches, knock on doors, do the grunt work of just sort of, bare-knuckle retail politicking to help her. And boy, this was a huge dilemma for me, because although I was no longer a reporter, I still felt sort of spiritually connected to that practice, to trying to look at events with as objective an eye as possible, and sort of to enter the world of politics was just sort of a huge step for me. And I don't think I would have done it for really anyone other than Gabrielle, not just based on friendship, but based on that I just believed that someone as thoughtful as her, someone as pragmatic as her, someone just as genuinely a good a person as she was, if more people like that were in the United States government, we would be truly an even more exceptional nation. And so I took the step and went back to Arizona, my home state, in 2006, and we squeaked out a primary victory, and she won a decisive victory in the general election. And my gosh, my old friend is a member of Congress all of a sudden. This is unbelievable. In 2010, she faced a stiff challenge on the part of her opponent. And in those days, when I went back to help her again, moved back to Tucson yet again to write speeches and to do sort of grunt-level political work, something had happened. I really did not recognize my hometown in a way that was very troubling. The things that were said, the level of the dialogue had sort of gone beyond the ordinary sort of short and spiteful dialogue of a contentious election, and it moved into a sort of a new realm of viciousness. And I didn't like what I saw. And she was reelected, and I profoundly wish that we had lost that election now, as we all know what took place on January 8th. So I'm going to read to you here from part of this book. It's called A Safeway in Arizona, which attempts to locate this event in what I believe is its proper context. That too much of the discussion around this event has been centered on that this was a lone act of a deranged gunman, that this was only about the madness of one single individual. and that nothing could have been done, that this was something like a natural disaster, sort of a force majeure for which there was no societal cause. And for me, context governs so much of our actions. The environment that surrounds us determines far more about the ways that we behave than we're aware. And this extends, too, to the mentally ill. Study after study has shown that those who suffer from what the gunman here, his name is Jared Loughner, the malady that he was suffering from, paranoid schizophrenia, the delusions that are manifest in that, and the types of ways that these individuals are pushed really is a factor of the society and the influences that surround them. And so while the delusions are deep, the equipment to see, the equipment to hear is still very much operational. And they operate not only in their own world, but they also operate in the larger world. So this is a point about this that I felt very strongly needed to be made. So I'm going to set this up just briefly here for you. This sort of begins in the midst of the 2010 election cycle. And I think there's only one individual that I should identify here, Gabe Zimmerman, who was a friend of mine, who lost his life on January 8th. He makes an appearance here. So Gabe Zimmerman is his name. So this is, right here, I'm going to start reading, and this is the last weeks of October of last year. I saw almost nothing of Gabrielle during those weeks and kept my head down in the office with picayune tasks, feeling terribly unsuited to the bare-knuckle brawl that this race had become. When I asked Gabrielle how it felt to be so publicly vilified, she shrugged it off and changed the subject. Some people had taken the nastiness to a new level. Roger Salzgeber kept a Giffords for Congress sign in his front yard and aimed the landscape lights in such a way that it would be illuminated at night. And he woke up one morning to find the lights smashed out on a single word scrawled in marker across the campaign sign: slut. With no speeches left to write, I went down once more to the town of Bisbee and rapped on doors and made phone calls all day long, trying to rouse the uninspired out to vote. And as the sun went down on the evening of November 3rd, I finished up my last knockings in the tracked fringes of the San Jose neighborhood and drove up to the party at the Marriott Ballroom, where Gabrielle was encircled 3 deep by a jungle of boom mics and cameras. Gabe Zimmerman was there on the far fringes, watching discreetly, and we briefly caught up. The official results weren't in by the 10 p.m. newscasts. In fact, it would take nearly a week for Gabrielle's victory to be counted to everybody's satisfaction. But it was clear from the precinct patterns then that we were going to squeak this one out. Not nearly so fortunate were the Democrats on the state legislative level, who had almost all been slaughtered. I caught a plane the next morning without proper goodbyes, feeling a mixture of relieved and moody. I didn't like what I had seen. Arizona seemed caught in a sickness that had only been aggravated by the worst elements of its substructure, which was really just a telescope version of some of the recent dysfunctions in the American substructure. The chilly, disconnected neighborhoods, the televised anger, the misinformed hysteria about immigrants, the delicate economy tied to reckless housing growth, the way that otherwise good people were so ready to devour each other when things got tough. It wasn't just in Arizona. The 2010 election cycle had been among the most antagonistic of recent years. A Wesleyan University study found that just 26% of the television ads aired during that season were designed to showcase positive attributes. The rest of the ads, the vast majority, almost 3/4, were either black and white contrasts or outright attacks. I had read of an experiment in social stress where rats of differing strength were placed together in a close quarter cage, which always provoked a fight between the rats. and the loser experienced what the researchers called social defeat and withdrew into sullenness, showing feeble interest in playing or running on wheels or inside tubes or the things that rats normally do. The humiliation had driven them into corners, and my home state had felt a bit like that. The noise and the economic pressure and the isolation were becoming unbearable, and instead of working together to solve the root problem, people were instead looking for domestic enemies, clawing and biting each other into submission, though they were innocent. Gabrielle phoned me a few weeks later, and she was downbeat herself. The campaign had been the nastiest one of her entire career, and she would be returning to Congress in the minority, which would make it nearly impossible to pass any kind of bill that wasn't a fluffy co-sponsorship. Jesse Kelly, that was her opponent, would probably run against her again, perhaps with more cash and less tomfoolery, and it was uncertain if the president would recover his popularity enough in southern Arizona to lift her tide by 2012. I told her about some of my discouragements with the campaign, and she acknowledged it had been rough. Well, you won, I remember saying, and that's the important thing. But she would have to make adjustments. In a symbolic gesture, she voted for the Georgia Democrat John Lewis to be the minority leader instead of Nancy Pelosi, who she personally liked, but who had become an attack ad liability for her back home. She and her parents were going on a trip to Rome over the Christmas holiday, and we would miss each other in Tucson, but we made vague plans to have dinner together in DC in February. I congratulated her again, and we said our goodbyes on what was an otherwise unremarkable catch-up conversation. I looked at my phone bill later on, and that conversation was on the 21st of November, a Sunday evening in the time of year when it gets dark early, and 9 days before Jared Loughner went to buy a Glock 19 pistol from the Sportsman's Warehouse. I heard about it via phone that morning, and my first call was to Gabe Zimmerman to make sure that he was okay. I left a message on his voicemail. 5 hours later, I learned he was dead, shot in the head. And Gabrielle, quote, shot in the head at point-blank range, close quote. Nothing at all prepares you for those clinical and near military words when it is applied to people that you know and care about. 17 other people shot for no reason at all, including a 9-year-old girl. Putting a bullet into another person is a decisive and irrevocable statement. We don't want you anymore. We want you erased from the earth. Some self-appointed avenging judge had made this verdict, and it could not be contradicted. National Public Radio had her dead for 50 minutes, and when those reports were set straight and the surgeons at the University Medical Center gave their news conference saying Gabrielle would live through the day, I started looking for a flight to Tucson. The first web videos from Jared Loughner were spooky and disgusting. I couldn't watch them for very long. When the news slowed after midnight, I drank 4 straight scotches with a friend and sat on the lip of the bathtub and cried without restraint for her and Gabe. I wish that we had lost that election. I wish I would have made Jesse Kelly president on the spot if it would have meant there wouldn't have been a Congress on your corner at that Safeway. The next several days passed in a distended haze, the hours on shuffle. The international press swarmed down on landscapes that had been familiar to me all my life, now the tableau for a terrible opera. The shooting was the backdrop for every major newscast for a week. NBC News paid thousands of dollars to rent a house on a nearby bluff overlooking the Safeway and built a stage in its backyard for a nice view of the parking lot. I had driven past that site, La Toscana Village, perhaps more than 10,000 times in my life. My adolescent braces had been installed and tightened by an orthodontist across the street. And though it was only about 2 miles from the family home, it occurred to me I had never once passed by there without the aid of a car. My mother shopped there twice weekly and knew some of the clerks by sight, though not by name. She and my father had been out running an errand further down Minor Road earlier in the morning. If they had needed some more milk, or a light bulb, or a few avocados for guacamole, they would have been stopped, noticed the names, and surely decided hello to Gabrielle. Then they would have been killed for pleasure. two of Loeffner's trophies. I felt a chill that nearly everyone perceived in those first several hours, the fineness of the border between living and dying, and how we are so dulled into believing it's an iron cord and not as breakable as a spider's thread. I wandered through those first few days like an automaton, not knowing what to say or do, and spent an inordinate amount of time looking at the Santa Catalina Mountains, visualizing the canyons that I had hiked there and wishing I could disappear into them for a week, to listen to the wind and watch lizards crawl on the rocks and hear nobody speak any words to me at all. The galaxy turned around the gravitational hub of a police-guarded suite at University Medical Center. Our wounded queen, a small and inscrutable body, lying perfectly still and breathing. The congressional office at the corner of Piedmont's One became a sweat chamber of activity. The conference room next door was quickly rented out to handle the overflow of interns, volunteers, and orphan campaign staff who had flown to Tucson to follow kind of a homing instinct. The lobby to the office had a giant saddle on display and a revolving knot of people talking in funereal groups. Gibbs Zimmerman's office near the back was left unused. His case of Diet Dr. Pepper left untouched. The outer door was hung with a note saying that packages could not be accepted. A permanent sign hung on the jamb said, "It is unlawful to carry a firearm into a federal facility." Title 18, Part 1, Chapter 48, Section 30. This had been the same office that had had its windows smashed during the healthcare crisis. A few brave constituents came in to sign the guest book and offer hugs to Joni Jones, the gracious office manager. Sagging cradles of hot lunch came delivered from local restaurants who, like us, just wanted to do something that might be useful. Staffers flown in from the DC office tapped their BlackBerries as if they were grabbing a pen on their chest. Most of them looked as though they were old enough to be sweating out a chemistry midterm. It has long been a fact of American governance that the legislative branch consumes early 20-somethings like an ever-replenishable fossil fuel. Without them, nothing of consequence would ever get done in the Capitol. That tender and excellent combination of stay-up-all-night energy, nervous ambition, high self-regard, and unquestioning obedience makes for a stack of waterproof policy papers and ridiculous spreadsheets. I stood around and watched all the journalists tromp through, a lot of local reporters that I recognized, and a flotilla of national and foreign correspondents that I didn't recognize. The Safeway shootings had become an international obsession and would remain so for most of the time. It did not hurt at all that Gabrielle happened to have been attractive. There are few stories that resonate in the human subconsciousness more than a young, beautiful woman in danger. And Gabrielle's improbable survival advanced the story into the realm of universal mythos. The journalists were all as hushed and respectful as we were, perhaps even more so given the guilt of their necessarily invasive work. The trapezoid courtyard of the office plaza felt like a cemetery that week. A uniformed Tucson police officer stood at the metal gate outside. Psychological comfort. There was an inert fountain painted in garish blue on the inside, dry. I opened my laptop in the conference room and wrote a few emails for the reconstituted communications team. Helped go through some of the letters that had cascaded in. Gabrielle would have wanted every address logged and every note to receive a corresponding thank you note. These letters filled at least a dozen postal bins at this point, varying postmarks from everywhere, but mostly from within southern Arizona. The rule of thumb for Congress is that for every thoughtful person who writes you a letter, there are probably 1,000 more that feel that same way and stay silent. These get well cards were a torrent of optimism and sorrow. Those from children occasionally had the feel of having been encouraged by parents are teachers, perhaps as a lesson in civics. Others seemed like their own simple expressions of projected grief. Their leader was not here in an unapproachable statue in a marble pantsuit, but rather a vulnerable human being who bled and cried and might get better. I learned later that some of the letters for kids included crumpled wads of lunch money. The curving stucco wall outside had been decorated for the last 4 years with the legend, Gabrielle Giffords, United States Congress. Now this low structure with planters had become one of 3 impromptu shrines that had instantly materialized around the city. There was a pile of flowers and cards beneath one of the Italianate arches at the Safeway, Toscana Village, and an astonishingly huge array of candles, flowers, balloons, cards, pictures and plush toys on the front lawn of University Medical Center where the national television satellite trucks surrounded them like a Praetorian guard. The man with the violin had taken a plane in the violet light before sunset, and people linked hands to pray among the offerings. The UMC staff had used stone markers to create little paths through the cards and the flowers. This resembled a road version of El Tiradito, the shrine to an outcast. We all knew that the impromptu memorials would eventually have to be dismantled, the letters filed away in an archive, the candles blown out, the balloons tossed away. These splashes of color on the hospital lawn and on the office corner and at the Safeway were all necessarily ephemeral. Safeway reopened exactly 1 week after the shootings, the parking lot clear finally of police cars and FBI agents. The blood was washed away, and the plate glass windows had been replaced. A moment of silence was held at 10 a.m. that day to honor the victims. The grocery store put a metal sawhorse under one of the Italianate arches as a designated pole spot for all the flowers and cards and candles that the people dropped off there. Barney Lucas, the human resources manager, called it the center of healing. I watched people go into the Safeway, buy plastic cones of flowers, and drop them at the sawhorse. A woman crossed herself. Years down the road, a man named Mike Santa Cruz told me, years down the road I knew I would kick myself in the butt if I didn't come down here during the moment of grief. Another visitor was Reverend John Kitagawa, the pastor of St. Philip's in the Foothills Episcopalian Church, which John Murphy had built in the 1920s to serve the Beverly Hills of Tucson and its new residents. It's important, he told me, for people to come here as part of the healing process. That's the shock of this whole thing. Most of the people here on that morning were doing their normal routines. I asked him why he and his wife had come this day, and he paused and said, we needed milk. That was the deciding factor. In the second week of Gabrielle's stay in intensive care, I assigned myself the task of finding a home for all the piles of stuffed animals that were mounting out near the corner. The skies were high and hard, but I worried about a frost or a rain shower that might get them wet. That would turn these stuffed animals moldy and even more pathetic. They deserve better than to be thrown out with the trash. I talked it over with some of the Washington staff, and we agreed that the best alternative would be to donate them to a charity. An obvious one was Casa de los Niños, the local shelter for abused and neglected children. We also chose the UMC Pediatrics Unit as well as the other big hospital in town, Tucson Medical Center. A few phone calls sealed the deal. Casa de los Niños and TMC were thrilled. It was one way to be in touch with what was happening, to have another small connection to the death and resurrection myth in their own hometown. UMC had to beg off taking anything but the animals that were still in their store packaging because of infection protocols. Sick kids couldn't be clutching teddy bears that somebody might have sneezed into. This made sense, and we could still make a delivery. We had at least 20 pristine brown bears wrapped in plastic that somebody, and I never found out who, had delivered in a giant crate to the office. Now I went to gather up the rest from the street corner. Alongside them were notes, laid out in the weak winter sun, addressed to nobody in particular. Beginning today, said one, treat everyone you meet as though they were going to be dead by midnight. Give them all the care, kindness, and understanding you can muster. I tried to thread gently between the candles and the construction paper messages on my way to pick up the first armload of stuffed animals. There was a tiger at rest, a bear with outstretched arms, a knuckle-dragging gorilla with big teeth. I tried to look official, as this probably looks like a sacrilege or perhaps a larcenous activity of a handful of people milling around the corner, but nobody came forward and asked me where I was going with these toys. I took them into the conference room and laid the first load on a folding table. We were targeted, said another note. We were hit, but we will not be destroyed. Here was the remarkable thing I began to notice after a few armloads. Only a few stuffed animals came with signed notes. The vast majority, probably 95% of them, had been deposited with no written message at all. And those that weren't signed with anyone's names. The animal itself was the message. A number of them looked like tough old veterans. The fur had been rubbed off in places, or it was a bit pilled. I wondered if empty nest parents had raided them from their grown-up children's closets and left them here like orphans. Or perhaps children had given up their own stuffed toys to the wounded queen, choosing to give as best as they could. A good number of them were brand new with manufacturer's tags still attached and their velour not yet grubbing. The toy stores and the stationery outlets in the malls must have made an unexpected fortune during those awful weeks in January. The folding table mounted and mounted with smiling balls of colored rayon and polyester. Mr. Potato Head wants you to get better, sir. Moving these toys probably would have been much easier with a hefty bag or at least a couple of the dingy plastic U.S. Postal Service bins, but that seemed disrespectful, as though I were removing trash. I also wanted to touch each one as I was taking it away. I'm not sure why. I harvested a tiger with a pink nose, a Dumbo with the Disney tag still attached, dozens of bears with hearts on their sweaters, a black dog in a Harley shirt, an orange lion, Ernie, Pinocchio, a Democrat donkey and a Republican elephant standing together happily in stars and stripes, a multicolored hippo out of a stoner's dream, a bear in a silver aviator suit from a unit at Davis Monthan Air Force Base, a Nurse Nancy with a message scrawled on her in black pen, I'm watching over you as long as you need me, a pink bear with a hug me heart, a red dog with a candy cane tail, gray dinosaur, a yellow bird, Superman with his arms extended, Barney Rubble, a pink dolphin, a bear with a note, my name is Pie, and I am nice to hug, a reindeer with a green hat. They were all squeezed into the planter and underneath the signs. I accidentally stepped on several of them. Eventually I had to give up and bring out a postal bin. The sun was drooping. By the end of the day, there were perhaps 300 of them heaped on the tables, making black threaded smiles to the ceiling. Last Saturday, said a note, they got up and ate breakfast. They considered what they would say to their congressman. They made plans for later. And this in an instant, their plans and voices were stopped. Tucson was changed forever. 2 interns and I went over to the hospital the next day and started in there, harvesting our way carefully through the maze. Only a few people asked what we were doing or where we were going with these bears. There were many more candles here. One of them splashed red wax on my pants after I tripped over it. There were painted tiles, birds in folded paper, and somebody's wedding photo, and even more animals than there had been at the corner, also lacking any written comment. The sun poured down on all of us as I pulled them up and walked them to the trunk of the car. In went a bear in a jester suit, a frog with orange hair, a dog with the cap of the LA Dodgers, Betty Boop holding a placard, "Get well, Gabby." Her husband, Mark Kelly, told a reporter they had gone out to take a look at the memorial one evening and had selected a small brown bear at random to bring up to his wife's bed, where it lay at her side for the next several days, an emissary among multitudes. "Gabby, we are sending you wish dust because we hope you feel better. We wish you can feel our love and hope for your total recovery." It is hard to discuss stuffed animals without sounding either ridiculous or black morose. They have an intrinsic pathos about them, and they're also very difficult to throw away. Tossing one out is a bit like drowning a mouse in a backyard pool. These are soulless, inanimate objects, but they were made to be repositories of affection, reminders to a child that the world is perhaps a warm place and not a cruel one, and that love might be given without question. To forget about one or to throw one away in the trash is a bit of a memento mori, a reminder that we too could perhaps be forgotten or thrown away. And there is the sadness of their faith, their willingness to be picked up and held, though the affection channeled through them lasts for such a brief time, if at all. I had a friend once who told me she hated receiving them for Christmas because they would invariably grow old and break. Seeing them new and unstained made the inevitable breaking even sadder for her somehow. Please heal, dear Gabrielle, and come back to us. We need you. I felt myself crouching behind a wall of tears that month and was never really able to make myself cry again after the night of January 8th, but this heap of stuffed animals that strangers had brought for Gabrielle was starting to bring me close to that wall again. I had cause to remember a poem which my mother had once paraphrased for me when I was about 12 years old. And I looked it up later. It was an extremely sentimental and bleak rhyme from a newspaper editor named Eugene Field, who wrote in Chicago at the end of the 19th century. Here is most of this rhyme. The little toy dog is covered with dust, but sturdy and staunch he stands. And the little toy soldier is red with rust, and his musket molds in his hands. Time was when the little toy dog was new, and the soldier was passing fair. And that was the time when our little boy Blue kissed them, stood them there. Aye, faithful to little boy Blue they stand, each in the same old place, awaiting the touch of a little hand, the smile of a little face. And they wonder, as waiting the long years through in the dust of that little chair, what has become of our little boy Blue since he kissed them and put them there. I had originally thought this poem was about the cruelty of growing older. We gradually forget our imaginary friends and the complicated dramas of our superheroes, putting childish things behind us and move on into the clarity and banalities of the adult world. Little boy Blue wasn't coming around to play with the dog or the soldier anymore, or invest them with imagined life because he had grown into a man and he'd forgotten his own silly games. As I had left Superstar Baseball and my own stuffed toys behind. When I was a child, I spake as a child, I thought as a child. I later read that one of Eugene Fields' sons had died very young, and the poem actually was about the literal death of the boy. He had given life to his belongings, but they were beyond biology. They could wait for his animating gaze forever. When we finished harvesting, there were just over 900 of them by my count. They filled 2 long folding tables and a good portion of the floor beneath them. We took photographs. An older woman came by with a minivan and we loaded them in. Gabrielle's press team had sent email alerts to all 5 local TV stations in the networks, and we made a caravan going from Casa de los Niños to UNC, where a bearded cameraman from NBC besieged me with questions that I had few answers for. The gift of the bears to orphaned and sick children would make cute little B-roll for the breakfast shows, and it occurred to me again just how strange life looks when a camera is pointed at it. How it automatically molds into a cartoon version of its own self, just like the bears. At the third and last delivery stop at Tucson Medical Center, the hospital arranged a half circle of kids recuperating in wheelchairs to say a big thank you in chorus for the bank of television cameras. You stay strong, and we will be strong. We need to make this a better place. Tucson was looking for ways to grieve and to make atonement. Hopeful messages went up on marquees all over town. Be kind to one another, said one outside the Boondocks Lounge. Crowds filled McHale Arena at the university to hear President Obama deliver a eulogy to the victims. Some people had camped out the night before and waited more than 20 hours to hear him. He announced that Gabrielle had opened her eyes after being in a virtual coma for 6 days. We recognize our own mortality, said the president. We are reminded in the fleeting time we have on this earth what matters is not wealth or status or power or fame, but rather how well we have loved and what small part we have played in bettering the lives of others. Two friends, Amanda Hutchinson and Amanda Lopez, used Facebook to organize a walk for peace. The next day, it terminated in the parking lot of Gabrielle's office. Hundreds of people joined in. A 14-year-old girl offered free hugs to passerby. An entrepreneur opened a hot dog stand near the end of the march. Vinny's Dogs, $3 original hot dog, $1 donated to the victims and families for every dog sold. Stay strong, Tucson. Gabby opened her eyes. So can we. On a day that marked an apogee of collective grief, Gabrielle was moved to a rehabilitation center in Houston, Texas, January 21st, and crowds lined the sidewalk outside Campbell Avenue to see off the ambulances, which was led by a group of motorcycle riders from the local VFW. The route of the motorcade had been published in the Arizona Daily Star. Her staff told reporters that she smiled from her gurney when she heard the crowds cheering for her, and this was important. They wanted a sign, any sign from her at all. My family will not forget, said another note. We will do our part to continue to fight against violence, promote peace. In the rear conference room of Gabrielle's office, I talked with Ross Zimmerman, Gabe's father, a Midwesterner by birth and temperament who had loved Gabe like a best friend. He was in deep shock and his eyes were exhausted, but he told me he had no anger about the casual murder of his son. He said Jared Loeffner was a, quote, poor sick child, close quote, more deserving of pity than vengeance. He had lived in a world of his own construction and perceived grievances that were only illusions. I'm not angry, said Ross, because there's nothing to be mad about here. I was angry for maybe the first hour when I didn't know what was going on. And believe me, if I had been at the scene and in a position to do something, I would have done whatever was necessary to stop this from happening, up to and including to causing any necessary harm to that poor kid. But that's a different issue. This is like a bolt of lightning. It had nothing to do with Gabe. It wasn't personal. That kid didn't know Gabe existed, just fixated on an authority figure associated with his poor, sick problems with this world, and he wanted to cause harm to the authority figure and everybody around her. He went on, the roots of anger go back to a sense of perceived unfairness. When you're growing up and have been brought up in such a way that doesn't map well to the real world, the pragmatic world, you want to build a story in your head, a model. That's not adaptive. It's not real. Thank you.